Hello and welcome to the Dissidents podcast, brought to you by the Institute for Liberal Values. This is where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. In this week's podcast, Brandy Shufutinsky, David Bernstein, and Mike Burke discuss and compare contemporary antisemitism both on the critical social justice left, the more traditional left, and the right. The first part of this podcast was recorded before the brutal and shocking terrorist attacks performed by Hamas against Israel on October the 7th, in which more Jews were murdered in the most brutal way than any other event since the Holocaust. So the tone of the first part is quite different to the tone of the second part. It's playful, we have a bit of fun, although discussing quite serious problems that were obvious to all of us even then. Then October the 7th happened, and I felt that we had, within the space of 1 week, crossed from one era to another era. The era before October the 7th, when antisemitism was a big problem, to the era after it, in which it is being actively mainstreamed in many of our most prestigious organizations. A deeply scary time. So to follow up, we recorded an addendum with myself and Brandy, discussing what needed to be updated. Hello, and everybody. Welcome to the Dissidents podcast. I'm here with David Bernstein, who is on the board of directors, I believe, of the Institute for Liberal Values, of which I am a fellow. And you're also the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, which seeks to promote the same sort of thing. So very, very thank you for that. And also Brandy Shufutinsky, who's also one of our hosts now and presents some content with us on the ILV podcast, and also with Free Black Thoughts as well, I believe.
What's your ILV?
Okay, yeah, which are kind of recently a part of ILV now, so very happy about that too. So I suppose let's start with anti-Semitism as it grows out of the woke movement. I think in your book you're quite keen to distinguish wokeism from critical social justice, because one does not necessarily entail the other, perhaps. But perhaps you might.
It's
begin by
interesting. I'm not sure.
that, yeah.
I'm not sure. I don't personally make that distinction. I think I make distinctions between gradations of ideology. And in other words, I think there are more extreme versions of an ideology and ideologues and less extreme versions of it. Critical social justice to me means the same as wokeism. It's a more technical term than wokeism. What I mean by that, and not everybody uses the term in the same way, but what I mean by that, either critical social justice or wokeism, are basically two tenets that bias and prejudice and oppression and racism are not just a matter of one's personal attitudes, but they're ingrained in the very systems and structures of society. And the second is that only people with lived experience of oppression have the qualification and the insight to define it for the rest of society. So we have to defer to people with lived experience in that way. Now, like, I would say both of those things can be true. Like, it can be true that there's injustice ingrained in the very fabric of society. And it can be true that people with lived experience of oppression have something to say to the rest of society that we should at least hear out. But it's not always true. And that second tenet can sometimes weaponize the first. It can be a way of saying that my definition or my perception of injustice must be adhered to, or else you're acting out of privilege. So that's what I mean by both critical social justice and wokeism. And there are people who might fall into either of those categories, who are not necessarily mean-spirited about it,
Mm-hmm.
and may be open to some questioning. And I think, certainly that's the moderate wing, but some aren't.
Brandy, would you have anything to add to that definition?
No, I mean, I see them kind of being being very closely aligned to ideology. And I think that when I consider whether it's wokeism or critical social justice ideology, I don't think that I make a clear distinction. I think that there's a distinction between what Dr. Tabiali describes as classical social justice and critical social justice. And I think that we could have there's a distinction between those two things. So somebody can be for social justice in the classic sense, without adhering to woke ideology, which shuts down differences of opinion and conversation and debate on those issues.
Do you think that there is a seat at the table for people who might subscribe to a milder form of critical social justice? Either
I
of
guess
you?
it depends on what you mean by a milder form. Like a seat at the table. The question is, will they give us a seat at the table? In other words, I think Brandy and I both consider ourselves people who care about social issues deeply and want to see as much equality and alleviate as many disparities as possible. The question is, if we don't accept their diagnosis of what ails society, are we still welcome at the table? For many years, I worked on issues like criminal justice reform in the United States, which is, where there's 2 million people incarcerated. And I always felt that, keeping people in jail for years and years and years for low-level drug charges was an injustice, and that
Absolutely
fell upon African Americans more than it did others. And I was willing to fight for that. But what I found is that as the space became more ideological, they were not as willing to welcome me anymore, because they wanted sort of ideological purity tests, and I wanted sort of action on the issues.
Gosh, that sounds absolutely frightful. I mean, the reason I would ask about, in terms of, sorry for my, even the Queen laughs at my English. The reason I would add that I personally think that some of the people who would adhere to critical social justice should have a seat at the table. Well, there are two reasons for that. One, in my cancellation, where lots of people came after me, some critical social justice types actually stood up for me and said, wow, he hasn't done anything at all, and this is completely fair, and just because he rejects the ideology, it doesn't follow that he believes all these other associated things that you're tarring him with. That doesn't follow at all. And so I was really kind of happy to see that. And second, is we've got to kind of walk it back at some point. Do you know what I mean? There has to be, because wokeism is so deeply embedded within society, that I don't see any way of having a comprehensive ideological defeat of these people.
It's not going to be vanquished. No one vanquishes anybody. That's the thing.
Right.
You might silence some people for some period of time, but they won't vanquish, the right. They're not going to vanquish the moderates, and we're not going to vanquish them. So you have to ultimately try to come to a place where there's room in society to talk about issues again.
See, my hope would be that they...
Okay. I'm not as optimistic on that. I think that an ideology that adheres to it's my way or you have to shut up and be silenced actually it comes very close to vanquishing those that are in the center, not necessarily those that are completely on the opposite, because at that point, the people that are on the complete opposite sides of the political spectrum are looking for a fight and then therefore need an enemy. Those in the middle are the ones that seem to be consistently silenced.
Well, to give you two historic examples of that, I mean, the obvious one being, if you want to talk about anti-Semitism, would be the Nazis, right? But then also, by the same measure, the communists, who fully had this ontology of the world exists because of this oppressor and oppressed group. It could be the Jews in Nazi Germany, or it could be the even more vaguely defined bourgeoisie in the former Soviet Union. And eventually you can point out maybe a few badly behaving rich people in the Soviet Union who, probably there were one or two, put them up against the wall and shoot them. But then eventually you run out of oppressors, and then you end up turning on, the Mensheviks, who are your comrades in arms. Then you've got rid of all of them. And then you look at the party conferences of the Bolsheviks, so the people were doing all the purging themselves. They're there in the one photograph. And in the next photograph, even before Photoshop came along, they're all gone, right? They were no longer there at that conference. And so, I think there is a point where an ideology like that can capture a society. And at that point, you're almost in a kind of Karl Popper-like dilemma, aren't you? It's like, you want to be tolerant. Like, I don't want to purge communists who believe lots of things that I think are very, very silly. And I think Popper would say something like, and you shouldn't really, because even if they're coming out with intolerant stuff that might lead to a kind of a violent solution if they had any power. I mean, if you're I don't know. For example, if you're goose stepping to Wagner in your back garden, and your Nuremberg rallies, have a homeless person and, I don't know, a shrew or something, then there's there's no really need to suppress that. We can kind of roll our eyes at those people and just say what a loser. But they do have the potential to take over society. My worry, or my hope, is that as much as critical social justice, in I think the forms that we're talking about it right now, does represent a deeply intolerant ideology insofar as it seems to conceptualize of those who disagree with it as being in some way evil, right? Like if you're a black person who opposes it, you're acting out whiteness. You're against the official consciousness of the black people, which might be embodied by a white person like somebody like Robin DiAngelo, or a total fraud like Ibram X. Kendi. Well, this is a problem that predates wokeism. It's there in Marxism, like much earlier Marxism as well, and all the way back. Right. But I think I have met some people who subscribe to some of these ideas who are more reasonable. And what I would like to see, and this would not be perfect, and it wouldn't be justice either, but what I think the best case scenario is that some of these people who subscribe to this ideology do what many of the communists do today, in which they say, no, the Soviet Union, Mao's China, that was absolutely terrible, but they weren't the real communists. The real communists have never been tried, which is of course nonsense. But at least it allows a way back into society for those people without doing what they would have done before, which was to actually embrace Mao's China and embrace the Soviet Union. A kind of, I'm aspiring for a kind of a truth and reconciliation kind of committee. I don't know. Is that possible, or is that just me having a fantasy dream? I don't know.
I think I think it depends on who you're talking about. Like there's a hardcore group that is sort of merges from the long march through institutions. These are the ethnic
Gramsci
studies professor today that they are neo-Marxists. They are and they're really trying to they're trying to vanquish anybody who doesn't agree with them and eventually take over institutions. I think a lot of people who share sort of their epistemology in some very loose sense aren't necessarily trying to do that. They're trying to make society a better place. They don't know. They think that this is sort of bending the arc forward. And so they continue to advance ideas that shut down discourse and make it harder for people to talk to each other. Do I think and then there's another rung outside of that of people who sort of just go along with it. These are the people who say, well, wokeism is awareness of injustice. And I always laugh. Well, the word awareness is doing a lot of work there, isn't it? Like, in other words, let's substitute the word awareness with perception. And all of a sudden, or your opinion of what injustice is. And all of a sudden you have a different conversation. And awareness bespeaks the epistemology. It's like, I am aware of what's going on here. And that my awareness is almost absolute. And I think that there's a lot of people, though, that sort of buy into that in a very loose way. And I think if they start to see how it shut down discourse, if they see that there were people who actually were well-meaning and thoughtful and didn't agree with it, some of those people you might be able to pick off. But I really think our audience is the big middle, the moderate middle of Western societies, of the U.S., of Australia, of the U.K., of Canada, who don't adhere to this and just need to be sort of brought out. And if the critical social justice strategy starts to lose its power because there's a critical mass of people who now oppose it, I think it'll be much harder for them to make any ground. And I bet you a lot of those people who are sort of on the periphery of critical social justice, wokeism, I think those people will start to dissipate and sort of rejoin the ranks of the liberals.
Are you seeing any signs of that? Because I think I am. Brandy, are you seeing any signs of it kind of losing steam?
There are signs of it here and there, and I think that those are increasing. An example, we've been invited to speak in places that a couple of years ago, we've been shunned at. Now there's momentum there, but I want to ask what's driving the momentum. Is it more people becoming aware that maybe this ideology isn't all it's cracked up to be, or is it being driven by something else, like the fact that a lot of the policies that have been put in place based on this ideology are failing. And what I'm not seeing happen fast enough is that shift. So what
Hmm.
ends up happening is that a very woke, progressive, critical social justice based policies put in place, it fails miserably. And
Yep.
instead of acknowledging that failure or the data that comes from it, what's happening is we're seeing those policies be doubled down on in wider society. And that's where I get worried. You know, we've talked about this a few times, David, where I talk about what happens when the truth doesn't matter. And that's what I'm seeing. What happens when, if you bring up the truth or you bring up facts or you bring up data, oh, well, that's colonial, that's white supremacist ideology. And so let's just ignore it and keep doing what's failing miserably.
Yeah, how long can you continue to ignore the truth without creating a bit of an uproar? You know, I believe we're starting to see some of that, Mike and Brandy. I think if you look at Oakland, for example, you know, or a lot of the places where this has been translated into sort of policing and crime policy in the United States, where there are horrible problems of crime, there's sort of there's the making of a tremendous backlash that might start with people that are most vulnerable, minority communities that are living in the higher crime areas. I mean, if you're sort of a middle class person, black or white or brown, you can sort of escape that into your little enclaves. But a lot of the people that are victims of this can't escape. They have nowhere else to go. And the more they start to sort of register on the political Richter scale, the more you're going to start seeing elites and op-eds in the New York Times and other places that start to push back against this. So I do think the seeds of the backlash are underway, are been planted and are underway. It still has a long way to go. And what I think we're seeing now is a kind of cancel culture 2.0 in society. And what I mean by that is, like, there's now critical mass enough to push back against the ideology in a lot of settings. But institutions themselves are sort of captured, and the people who originally deferred to the ideology in that George Floyd moment can't really get out of it. They sort of signed on the dotted line of deference. And I think that's where we're stuck now. And it's also being translated, especially in the US, where you're getting closer to the political elections, into sort of the political process itself, where you know, moderate Democrats, for example, do not want to break ranks with progressives. So they continue to sort of front for the progressive wing of the party. And as a result, we have like a seemingly wider woke constituency than there might actually be.
And
Yeah, I
then,
mean,
I mean, the part of that I think is really concerning is that if the institutions, which hold more power than an individual person or even, you know, a community, if they're captured, even if individual people are starting to acknowledge the issues with far left or extremist policies, how possible will it be to actually reverse course or push past and through that without damage being done? And I think we're seeing damage being done already. You look at Seattle, you look at Portland, you look at San Francisco, and just taking one issue of drug use and overdoses, and those how much damage has been done based on those policies, that even if we start to move in the right direction, how many people are dead?
see, I mean, this
Yeah.
is crucial. This is absolutely crucial because, I mean, on the one hand, you know, you're both raising a really important point. I mean, Dave, you're not exactly saying this, but David, it's like this. It's so much an elite thing, isn't it? Brandy, you said that
Oh, for
it's
sure.
in within the elites, and, you know, of course, you know, which would tend to be highly affluent people, not exclusively, but tend to be highly affluent and highly privileged people, which is kind of ironic, isn't it? How much they claim to be. We're boasting about being on the sides of the downtrodden, whereas none of them are downtrodden. And, you know, and that's not my opinion. There's actual data on that.
Sure.
But also, what's so worrying about it? I mean, what happened with one of my cancellations is around about the George Floyd protest time. And people were posting up memes saying things like, if you have a problem with the way in which they are protesting, then you are part of the problem. And my point to those people was, for fuck's sake, guys, you have no idea what is going on. You know, at the time we didn't know. Even if it goes down that it's gone through a court of law and we're sure that this is a racist murder, it doesn't follow from that the Minneapolis police force is all racist, let alone the whole police force of the United States. And if you start to spin that narrative within the public, we know this because of the Ferguson effect, right? Police are going to, which was already established by that point, police are going to be afraid to go into the communities which need policing the most, which means the homicide rates, among other kind of violent crimes, are going to skyrocket amongst particularly the kind of people that you're boasting about being on the side of. And so you're actually harming the people you're trying to be on the side of. So that's what I said. And of course, they then said that I've gone down a right-wing rabbit hole, and they tried to stage a mental health intervention with my family, saying, "Oh, Mike, he's really great. He's a
Wow.
well-read guy, but you know, COVID's driving him mad. He's gone incredibly right-wing." And it's like, there's nothing right-wing about that observation, or left-wing. It could be made by either side. So yeah, I mean, this absolute elitism and this absolute disregard for the disregard or even contempt for the very people whose their identities are invested in. It's just so bizarre. And if you point that out,
I mean, I think it's paternalistic. There's the idea that we know better, listen to us, we'll take care of it, just follow our lead. And when people are saying out loud, no, I understand, even if they're saying, I understand you're here to help and your intentions are correct and honest and sincere, this is actually what we're asking for. No, be quiet. You just have internalized white supremacy. I mean,
it's disgusting. I mean, it's like, it's not even paternalistic, right? Because parents can be, like, I'm a parent, right? And I make mistakes and I do wrong things. Like I thought my kid lost his Switch and it was me. I put it somewhere and I told him off and I was like, oh my God, right? So as parents, we can do bad things. And you know, if you're a parent, I'm sure you've done bad things and beaten yourself up over it, right? But we care about our kids, and by and large, most parents love their kids very much and are a force for good in the lives of their kids. I'm not convinced that these people care about Black people. I don't see them listening to Black people. I'm not even sure that they necessarily, I'm not sure that they want to be a force for evil, although that seems to be what they are on balance. But I'm not sure they're that bothered about whether they're a force for good. I think it's all about posturing.
Yeah, I think it's mostly about that. There are people who, out of empathy, think that they should be listening to, you know, whatever the marginalized community is, and it, you know, feels very empathetic when they listen to people that are sort of the self-appointed spokespeople of any community, and it feels bad when you disagree with them, so they don't want to disagree with them. So I think there are people who haven't fully examined this, don't want to actually face the complexities of these situations, don't want to look at any other possible causes of disparity in any, you know, situation. They just want to be good people who are in line with in the community of the good, people who are, you know, trying to make society more just. And, you know, and it sort of shuts down critical thinking in that way, because your desire for alignment and empathy overwhelms your critical thinking skills and puts them. And that's why this spreads, because you don't have, there's no critical thinking filter for it. It says, if you think critically about this, then you are part of the problem. So people don't think critically about it.
But it's even worse than that. It seems to be like, if you want to do good, if you want to actually do good, if you're looking at an evidence-based way of thinking, and we're thinking, okay, we're seeing, for example, a Ferguson effect. We're seeing, for example, murders going up in African-American communities all over the United States. That's a bad thing, and we want to do something about it. That means that we have to criticize this ideology, right? But then by doing good, by attempting to do good, we're being seen as evil. And the people who are doing evil are rewarded by being seen as good, because the institutions that are capable of spinning that, like the New York Times or Harvard or whatever, will spin it that way, almost unbelievably.
Welcome to my life, Mike. Welcome to my life. And I'm
sure it's been mine for a while. It's been mine for a while as well. I mean, I don't have any friends left anymore apart from kind of ILV people, and you know what? Fuck it. I mean, they're
at least nicer anyway.
I'm sure, yeah. Well, thank you. And at least when my grandkids are around,
to talk to, because we can actually talk about things. Right?
Absolutely, talk about something. Right. I can ask you where you're from, for example, and I'll be like,
right, exactly.
All right, then. I mean, that's a final point. More generically on the ideology, I'd just like both of your advice on this, because I'm reasonably sure you've come across this kind of person as a kind of category of person. What do you do about the person who comes up to you, like I'm a university lecturer, who'll come up to you over the coffee break or by a photocopier machine, look around, make sure nobody's watching, and then say, Yeah, David, I really admire what you've done, and I really get it, and I appreciate it. And thanks for being brave. Well, thanks, Brandy, for being brave and standing up to these people. I'm fully, and then we'll even like give you a few examples that show that they actually understand and what you're doing and why it's right. And then in a public sphere, we'll either be completely silent, or alternatively, and this is what I've had, people who've supported me in private actually start cheering this stuff on.
Right. Right.
Have you had that experience?
Yeah, Michael Powell from the New York Times, did a report about what was going on at Smith College. And he had interviewed 14 professors who explained, almost all of them, I think 11 of the 14 were off the record about what was going on there. And then there was, after the New York Times story came out, there was a meeting with the president of the university, and some of the people who talked to Powell said that several of the people you talked to in this story actually condemned the New York Times article. So that's just, to me, grotesque. And I have no respect for somebody who does that. Now it's harder for certain people. I mean, who would have a lot to lose. I have a friend of mine who's very opposed to the ideology and fights against it quite publicly, whose wife was going, to a DEI seminar, and she said, "Sweetie, what should I do about this seminar? I'm looking at the materials; they're terrible." And he said, "One of us needs health insurance." So,
Yeah.
I think, right, one of us needs health insurance. So, don't lose your job, right? So I think, I'd like more people to take more chances than currently do. I think some people can't take chances without losing their jobs and maybe shouldn't. But for the most part, I think this is a courage project. This is a project to get more people to speak out. I like to say that we're in the courage business. And when I think of it that way, I think about the kind of initiatives that we should undertake that try to get people to speak out. And sometimes it's talking people through their fears, and say, well, what would really happen if you speak out? And several times I found that gets people to think through the likely consequences of it and realize that, yeah, this is not like speaking out if you're an Iranian woman against the regime where you could be disappeared tomorrow. None of us are going to be disappeared. So shouldn't we be willing to take some chances for our liberal democratic values and culture? I think so.
And God bless those women, eh? I mean, wow.
Yeah, unbelievable. Or girls who scream down a party official in their school. I mean, unbelievable courage.
Or black people in the United States during the actual civil rights movement who might actually have been lynched, as opposed to kind of like, posturing and posing and the rest of it.
Yeah, I've got my T-shirt from Selma, Alabama.
Oh, wow, yeah. Very good. Okay, so let's then draw, because obviously the Jewish Institute of Liberal Values, let's then draw the link between this more, I don't know if you call it more modern, because, as Brandy was kind of alluding to it, Marxism might not be the same thing, but it's kind of morphing. It's kind of like this ideological shadow, like a Jungian ideological shadow no, it is though, isn't it? Because Jung says like, the shadow is blackest and most dense in those people who are not aware that they have one. And that's why, you get all of these ideologues in the Nazi party and the Bolsheviks thinking that we are absolutely on the side of the angels and we have zero like doubts of that we are pure good. And that's why it's unfortunate, but we have to kill these bunch of people. And they end up becoming the worst ideological evil that has ever afflicted humanity.
Sure.
Both of them. And arguably you could say that Nazism and communism both have that kind of ontology that unites them, and that it kind of flows into wokeism. But thankfully, wokeism hasn't got that powerful yet, and God, I hope it never does. But then there is another kind of version of that, and now I think about it, it is kind of a similar one, isn't it? Because it's the Bolsheviks are secretly controlling society, or the Jews are secretly controlling society. How does that kind of creep into woke ideology? Where did you encounter that? Could you talk us through that?
Well, I mean, I think that what do they say? History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I think there's some rhymes here with communism. Our colleague Isabella Tabarowski, who's a Jew from the former Soviet Union, talks about how anti-Zionism was really formed in the wake of the 1967 Six-Day War, when the Soviets realized that they had to discredit Zionism as a idea among Soviet Jews and in the larger public, and so they've invented a new field called Zionology, and we're still experiencing this like fierce anti-Zionism in today's discourse that actually sort of predated the popularity of wokeism in society. So that's been around. These ideas that they might fall out of fashion for a while, but they're always sort of on the shelf, and wokeism empowers them in some ways. So to me, where wokeism starts to sort of fuel anti-Semitism is in this sort of stark oppressed versus oppressor binary. It conflates economic success with oppression. The whole definition of equity is like, if you are a group that on average is doing below the bar, then you're by definition being discriminated against. And if you're a group by virtue of that same logic that is above the bar, then you must be complicit in supremacy, complicit in discrimination. And so I think the logic of that inexorably leads to anti-Semitism or anti-Asian sentiment or any group that on average does better. By the way, including
anti-Nigerians. Yeah.
So I do think that's where it sort of comes in. I mean, Jews always do better in more liberal, open societies and that might be the most important aspect of this. Is like, okay, we're the canary in the coal mine. So when a society starts to go in the wrong direction, Jews are more likely to sort of face the music first. But there are these other ways. The insistence that Jews are white and can't identify in their own terms. That has been integral to the Jewish experience in general. Is like wherever society we are, we have to sort of pay our pound of flesh, and our pound of flesh in wokeism is that you have to accept that you're white and then oppose your whiteness to sort of all of this does another thing that has severe implications for Jews, is that this extreme form of identity politics then exacerbates the identity politics on the right. I mean, you can't just say that every other ethnic group gets to have pride in themselves except for white people and expect to have any success with that. I mean, you might be able to make a cogent argument, but all you're going to be doing is inflaming these very ancient, dangerous passions that exist. And I think that's what's happening now as well, is that it's actually a cycle of anti-Semitism on the right as well.
Brandy, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing, contemporary anti-Semitism really manifest its way through anti-Zionism, which I think there are a couple of factors at play there. One is the movement of self-determination for the Jewish people in our indigenous homeland stands completely counter to supremacist ideology that Jews should always be victims. It also stands in stark contrast to people who want to rewrite history as far as indigenous peoples and what that means. And so the idea that, well, if the Jewish people could reestablish their modern state and their indigenous homeland, what does that mean for other indigenous peoples around the world? I think there may be an underlying fear for that. And so you have people that maybe, want to participate in a lot of this performativity on the far left, having to kind of look in the mirror and accept the fact that whether, they may be descended from people that were actually colonized the lands that they live on. And so instead of looking in the mirror, they're pointing the finger. And I think it's quite fascinating because these are people that portray themselves as progressive or liberal, but they're in fact kind of towing the same line that a lot of far right supremacist ideology spouts.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you look at what Ibram X. Kendi and what Richard Spencer would say about white people, it's pretty much the same thing, right? They would both argue that there is something, okay, one would say it is morally evil and one would say it's morally good, but they would argue that there is something adaptive about being white, right? If you look at it from a purely evolutionary point of view, that being white affords some set of abilities, whatever they are, that will allow you to climb above other people. Now, whether you do that through oppression or you do that through being productive or whatever, you're kind of saying the same thing, albeit from two different directions. And that's why they basically agree with each other.
That's why they really chilling. In some ways, they create each other, by the way.
Yeah.
They create each other because they both play on a certain resentment that is exploited by the other. And so that's what makes me worried. I mean, I'm more frightened by right-wing anti-Semitism and right-wing extremism because they have guns. And the other day I was talking online with a guy who's clearly like a white identitarian,
Oh
and
God.
he said to me, "What? You don't think we deserve our own Likud? Likud being the right-wing Israeli party, And I thought to myself, what am I going to say? Like what am I going to say to them myself? There's a sort of air of inevitability about this that
Oh
is
yeah.
very frustrating. Is like we need a vision of humanity. We needed a vision of being an American. We need a common language to be able to bring people together. And here you have people who are sort of trading in these grievances, thinking that this is going to somehow solve social problems, and the exact opposite. So I have this like every time there's sort of a woke platitude expressed in public, I just have this knot in my stomach about what it's doing in right-wing circles, how it's being received, how the poor person, white guy living in a formerly industrialized town whose granddaddy didn't even have a job since 1970, and where there's opioid addiction everywhere, how they're going to be reacting to the notion that they have privilege by virtue of their skin color. I just think it's a horrible social model.
It's
Horrible
terrifying.
social model. Yes.
Especially somebody who maybe is a bit of a loner, who doesn't have very many friends, and because you're a loner and you don't have very many friends, you're more likely to be maybe a little bit socially awkward. All of those things will make you targeted by an outrage mob, right? Because they if they had genuine racists out there, they'd be going after them. But there's a critical shortage of racists, right? So they're going to go after some of the weaker members of society. And then what happens to these people? Because human beings need in-groups, right?
Right.
Like you need to have a family or a support network around you. That's not my opinion. There's decades worth of psychological evidence on that. And if you don't have that support group, well, you're going to go somewhere to try and find one. And this is where right-wing groups, perhaps even overtly fascist right-wing groups who are diminished, in the post-war era, but kind of hung on, how they will be ready, willing to put an arm around these kids and give them a home. I mean, that's absolutely terrifying. And then that will lead people back into a resurgence of the kind of anti-Semitism that was mercifully marginalized, but never really went away. This kind of really ideological, as opposed to the kind of casual, stupid anti-Semitism, this kind of calculating, kind of horrible anti-Semitism that was something that possessed the Nazis.
I think
it's very, very worrying.
Go ahead.
Just the conversation gets watered down, where people don't want to address anti-Semitism that comes from the far left, because there's it's not as dangerous. It's not going to be someone on the far left that comes and targets or tries to shoot people in a synagogue or at a school. But what gets ignored is the dehumanization of Jews as people that happens on the far left. Kind of gives space and makes excuses then for those violent acts to happen from the far right, and they feed each other. So it's not like I don't like the game of the oppression Olympics, so I also don't want to play it on which type of anti-Semitism is worse, from the left or the right. It's not about which is worse. It's about anti-Semitism is bad and it's dangerous, and then when we see it, we should counter it and speak up and speak out about it.
Yeah. Let me add to that for a second. Sometimes some people say, Jonathan Greenblatt, who's the head of the Anti-Defamation League, the major Jewish defense organization in America, likes to say that anti-Semitism on the left, on the right, is like a hurricane, and anti-Semitism on the left is like climate change. But what he's not willing to say, and this is where there really is a distinction in how we tend to think about anti-Semitism coming from either end of the spectrum, is that he's not willing to cite the ideological CO2 emissions that produce the anti-Semitism on the left.
Right.
He's willing to talk about the ideological underpinnings of right-wing anti-Semitism. Why wouldn't he? Like, okay, so we're going to talk about the Great Replacement theory, in which immigrants are being brought in to replace ordinary Americans, and guess who behind the scenes is doing all the replacing? It's Jews, right? So it's easy to talk about that, but people treat anti-Semitism on the left as if it's a set of symptoms without any causes, whereas we don't talk about it in any other segment that way. And I think that's what dangerous is that we know that the anti-Semitism is linked to larger ideologies. It's a conspiracy theory that's nested in other conspiracy theories. And so the more crazy, Jonathan Haidt, the great social psychologist, likes to call American society structurally stupid today. The more society becomes structurally stupid, the more very simplistic explanations for what's gone wrong start becoming popular. The more there's QAnon, the more that there are crazy conspiracy theories that pretend to explain all reality, the more likely anti-Semitism will find its place in that consciousness. And I think that's the problem we're facing now.
Can we, and is there, and even if we could, is there any point in distinguishing between left-wing and right-wing anti-Semitism? Like, is because they kind of seem to flow into each other. It's not as if the ideas are very different. I mean, you know, if you hear the kind of the followers of Ibram X. Kendi, what they would say about Jewish people, and the followers of Richard Spencer, I would there be any difference?
I do, because I think that the far left anti-Semites who will always deny that they're anti-Semites, you know, they're fine accepting a certain type of Jew, and those on the far right aren't willing to accept anyone. So they're willing to accept a Jewish person who, as David says, you know, is kind of pays the pound of flesh to enter that far left progressive space. So if you denounce Israel and you deny that the Jewish people are a people, and just say that being Jewish is a religion, and if you do, you know, follow all of these steps,
right,
you can kind of be accepted in our space. Where on the far right, there is none of that. So I think that there is a distinction. That doesn't mean that the result in the experiencing anti-Semitism from the left or the right is any less harmful or damaging.
So Jews on the left kind of have dhimmi status, in other words, right? Like the Islamic.
Right. Yeah. Yep, they do. Yeah, I think that that's a critical distinction between the two. There is a horseshoe theory that they end up, you know, more or less in the same place at the extremes, but I think they manifest differently. I think the strategies are probably different. You know, anti-Semitism on the left is more ambiguous, better hidden than it is on the right. And the right is very brazen, and sometimes it's almost shocking. Like, I'll give you an example of this. My book comes out, Woke Anti-Semitism, How a Progressive Ideology Harms Jews, comes out, and I say, okay, I'm going to post it on all these sort of anti-CRT Facebook groups and the like, because I want people to buy my book, which is what authors do. And so I posted a bunch of places. In every single case that I posted on an anti-CRT Facebook group, somebody, and usually more than one, would say, you Jews created wokeness in the first place, so shut up. Every single case. And when you look at what happens on Twitter, sort of the mob, like Brett Weinstein the other day, he put up, he sort of said, look, that guy Samuel Bankman-Friedman, the guy who was the cryptocurrency dude who was, you know, recently indicted. He said, yeah, it's not, his Jewishness has nothing to do with it. His whiteness has nothing to do with it. He's a rent-seeking elite. And there was just this incredible outpouring of hate toward him and toward Brett for saying that. And they were saying he's Jewish. He's not white. He's Jewish. And there was sort of this thing of like, you know, he's Jewish hashtag that was going around. And so that's a right-wing phenomenon, and it's much more blatant than what you see on the left.
But I'm seeing some worrying signs of people who were probably like us, kind of 1990s liberals, right? I mean, you in your book, David, you make the distinction between what is it like somebody who's attitudinally liberal, like, you know, just kind of that. Those are my feelings. It's not really defined, and then somebody who's a political liberal who might be a conservative who wants to conserve liberalism or something like that. Yeah. You know, but and I'm both, by the way. I might, you know, obviously think these things through quite a bit, but I'm definitely a 1990s liberal as well, in the sense of kind of how I behave and how I feel and the rest of it. But even among some of the 1990s liberals who would still consider themselves to be liberals, and who would score left on a political compass test, but have gone anti-woke, here's some of the. I've seen some of the right-wing side of anti-Semitism infect them. And it's almost to this kind of like this, they've been out-grouped and they found an in-group with some anti-Semites who are against wokeism, maybe for all the right reasons, but then they're going to blame wokeism on Jewish people. And so, you know, the kind of conversation I'll have will be something like this. We'll be complaining about something that's happened. It'll be all like, yeah, this is fucking terrible. And then suddenly they'll notice, they'll say, yeah, but isn't it funny that wherever you go, there's always Jewish people like behind these things? It's like, what?
Right.
Who, for one, and they won't give you an example. Oh, I'm just saying, I'm not an anti-Semite. I'm just saying, isn't it? But it's there. It's those kind of right-wing anti-Semitism is creeping in.
Yeah, they'll say things around trans, that there's something about Judaism itself that it reinforces sort of trans ideology. I've heard that one a lot, and people that you think would know better start to say things like that. It's sort of like a permission structure for them to say all kinds of crazy things. And I think like that's Yashka Monk, the political scientist at Johns Hopkins, had a piece in the New York Times saying, look, like we have to make sure that we don't become unhinged ourselves. And it's easy. You can understand why, if you're not a really strong critical thinker, that all of a sudden, you have this group of people attacking you and calling you privileged or whatever else. You can see why you'd want to join the opposite tribe and then sort of go along with whatever they do.
Of course.
But I think I'm not going to do that. And I think that that's a losing proposition. I want to live in a society where we can have rational discourse and it doesn't morph into another form of liberalism.
But I think that's what ILV really is about, and I think that that's our unique thing, is that we really, really, really are resisting the kind of tribal pull. And by the way, that doesn't mean that we can't sometimes have a conversation with and side with conservative groups who, disagree with wokeness, but we can't just start letting anti-Semitism creep back into the picture, because it is. And I mean, the weird thing is that, as somebody from the UK, anti-Semitism still passes the dinner party test, right? So like in the UK, if you wanted to say something nasty about black people, quite rightly, you'd be shunned. You wouldn't, in any kind of sensible middle class, racism in the UK against black people exists, but it's more on the fringes of society. But the middle class dinner party test, no, you couldn't say anything like that. But you could say something about Jews. And like, for example, recently, a few years ago, there were some massive protests, pro-Palestinian protests going around in London. And there were groups of people in cars with megaphones shouting out, "Kill the Jews and rape their daughters." I mean, this was widely reported, and none of them were arrested.
But that also goes to show what happens when institutions get captured. And that's something I think that, Jews here in the US paid very close attention to, like, oh goodness, is that what it's going to be like here in a couple of years? Because there's David, what you said, there's it gives a permission structure for that type of rhetoric. And also, I think what we've seen in other places in Western Europe is a lot of Islamist anti-Semitism. And in the United States, there's this idea that only that type of bigotry only comes from the far right. And if you're a quote unquote person of color, you can't sit on the far right. So there isn't really, I think, a framework to how to discuss and how to address Islamist anti-Semitism. And I think we saw that with the man who took the people hostage at the synagogue in Texas, in Cooleyville, I'm saying it wrong.
Cooleyville, Texas,
yeah. Where immediately the first reports were coming out that it was some white supremacist, because we knew that the perpetrator had a gun and he was holding Jews hostage in a synagogue. Turns out he was an extremist Islamist, and he had a Islamist political motivation for going in there and holding these people hostage.
And why should that be surprising, by the way? I mean, like, if you look at historically who has oppressed Jews in the Levant, I mean, it's largely been Muslims. I mean,
I don't think we don't talk about different types of supremacist ideology that has been bigoted towards a lot of people, but in this instance towards Jews. So we don't talk about progressive supremacists or Islamist supremacists or black supremacists. We talk about white supremacists.
We're not allowed to, even though they're far more consequential. I mean, for example, David, if I was to ask you your background in terms of where your great grandparents and places like that were born, I mean, some of them were probably born in places in the Middle East where they had existed for generations and they can't go back to.
You don't have to go that far back. My mother is from Baghdad, Iraq. I grew up in a home where we spoke Arabic. And by the way, there was an extreme, and most of my Iraqi family has bitter feelings about their experience. I was just visiting a friend of my mom's from Baghdad in Toronto when I was there. I stayed at his house, And I said, well, what was it like for you? He says, I had very, very bad feelings. I would never go back to that country. Even if it was liberalized, I still wouldn't go back. There's this sort of myth that things were always great in the Muslim world and bad in the Christian world. I think if you compare the two, generally speaking, it was worse in the Christian world than it was in the Muslim world, but it was not. That doesn't make it good. And my mom was born, a couple months before the worst pogrom in Middle East history against the Jews. It was called the Farhud in 1941. So there's been some, Jews have always had a hard time in the Muslim world and have been viewed as sort of second-class citizens in many Muslim societies. There have been other times when they've been very well accepted. I think there were good moments in Baghdad as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I think going back to Brandy's main point, we're willing to talk about the ideological underpinnings of right-wing anti-Semitism, Christian anti-Semitism. But when we get to progressives, all of a sudden it becomes forbidden because we're talking about an ideology, this oppressor versus oppressed ideology, that a lot of people think is true. And even in the Jewish community, we can easily be, deplatformed and blackballed for having perspectives that might somehow suggest that progressive ideology is problematic.
Which gives cover for, Islamism, which isn't just hurting Jewish people either. I mean, if you look at what's still happening in the UK with gangs of working class white girls being raped and forced into prostitution, and they're starting to go through court now and they're starting to be prosecuted, but these gangs still exist, and we can't speak out against them because doing so conflicts with the progressive narrative. You can't talk about the fact that there are, for example, your family home in Baghdad that may have been within your family for generations, going back to great grandparents that you have some kind of connection with, right? You can't go back there ever again, or even if you could, you might be too traumatized to go back there. And we're losing these kinds of stories because of dogma, which is absolutely
because of dogma. Yeah, and we're not able to address social problems because people are too scared to be called a racist or something. And we're not talking about crime in an accurate way. We're not talking about medical issues in an accurate way. There was this whole thing during COVID about whereby younger Black and brown people were getting the vaccine before older people who were vulnerable. And it actually might have paradoxically led to more Black senior citizens dying too, not just white senior citizens dying. But it was just a bizarre set of policies around sort of what's considered equity. And you could listen into these sort of debates among the scientists, or not really debates at all, where everyone was sort of agreeing and nodding to this idea that yes, it is equitable to provide the vaccine to middle and upper class, young, healthy Black people before elderly white people. It probably cost thousands of lives. Yet that was the dogma. That dogma cost thousands of lives. This dogma is causing people in inner cities to lack police protection. This dogma is having homeless people who might be better served in mental institutions to be living in these open air drug markets. I mean, it really has very severe social consequences, and people can't talk about them. Or if they do, they're shut down. Yeah.
I think that there's a shift when we stop talking in terms of equality and started talking in terms of equity. That shifts the complete framing and how to address a lot of those issues and problems that we're still facing. So there was a mob of motorcyclists and dirt bikers driving through Center City, Philadelphia last night. A woman was delivering food on Uber Eats. She had her two young children in the backseat of her car. One of the motorcyclists jumps on the back of her car, smashes in the window on her kids. And there's this idea that maybe a policy to have less police would make the situation more just. And I think that the ultimate question is just for whom in a situation like that. Like who is it actually humane to have somebody sleeping on the sidewalk in a tent with rats and other types of public health issues, or is it more humane to get somebody into housing or a treatment facility that may make their lives a little bit better? And if we're only talking in terms of equity, and that's how we're talking about defining justice, then I think that we're going to see a whole lot more harm done before things start to get better.
And a very, very bad politics, because what it will do is ultimately these things can be sort of preserved in it. These myths can be preserved in institutions, but they can't be preserved at the voting polls. People vote their interests. So you basically opt for an unsustainable politics that will probably elect demagogues on the opposite end of the spectrum.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in a way, I'm kind of relieved that Trump is as incompetent and bumbling as he has been, because it could have been so much worse. I mean, you could have had somebody who was elected as a right-wing demagogue who really was articulate, who really, did have a kind of a very coherent message, and things could have been and may yet be absolutely worse. I mean, this is what absolutely terrifies me. I mean, I think this is one of the reasons why I was kind of encouraged to speak out against wokeism in the first place, because being somebody who was traditionally aligned with the 1990s liberal left, I saw where this was going. You're going to create a monster with this. If we tap into Jewish folklore for a second, because I'm a big fan of Jewish folklore. You probably get where I'm going here, right? In Prague, the golem, right? You create this monster, and it's there to kind of, it's there for a good purpose, and it's there to protect the community. And for a little while, it does that, right? It has that kind of use, and then it goes wrong. And this is, by the way, the postmodern observation of Marxism, right? Where they all kind of, like Foucault would, when he grew up eventually, Lyotard, when they grew up, the first generation postmodernists, they noticed that, okay, Marxism is kind of like a golem. It's like this thing that we can use to achieve positive ends. We can push back against certain kinds of bad thing, and it might be useful in that regard. But then suddenly, where that ideology becomes the filter via which everything is explained, and it's now popular and powerful, and it's shutting out other narratives, then it becomes exactly the thing, or even worse than that, would it set out to replace.
Absolutely. Chris Rufo had a debate the other day that he hosted on Twitter. I think it was called "No Enemies on the Right," and he had people debating that, and as if the extreme right, who you might disagree with, is actually useful to you. And so don't criticize them. Don't try to put them in their place, because they're ultimately useful to you. I think that's very dangerous thinking, and that's the golem like thinking. That's what ends up with people just acting in monstrous ways. And I think that's
because they might be useful to you up until a point, until they're not, right? And it's in a similar argument you get on the left. I think you alluded to this as well, David, in your book, and it's something that people were going after Helen Pluckrose with recently, and something people have said to me. The kind of person who would say this to me would be, the kind of former socialist journalist who was never fully a Marxist, but is now in his 60s, and he thinks that the woke people, they're all a bit eccentric, and occasionally they do something bad, but their hearts are all in the right places. That type.
Yeah, believe me, I know them well.
Oh my God. Sometimes they're academics as well. Some of these people will turn around to me and say, look, Mike, what you're saying about these people, it's not wrong. There are a few of them, and they're doing some bad things, and I agree with that. That's terrible. But what about the right wing? And then the first thing you say, well, what about them? It doesn't matter, right? They can both be wrong. And then the second thing, they can both be wrong. It's like, I'm from the left, and I'm more motivated to hold the left in check because that's what I care about, right? Like, I want to hold my own house in check.
Yeah, I always say that as well.
That's the one thing. And the second thing, but my academic specialism would be in the left. That's fine. It's like saying climate change is one problem, but it doesn't follow that you can't do any research into homelessness because we all have to focus on climate change. You know what I mean? That argument just falls apart so easily. But here's the other thing that really pisses me off. Mm-hmm. They'll say that, and then this is their knockout blow. They think they're putting up for a big knockout blow, and it's just so insipid. They'll say something like, you see, well, all of these arguments that you're doing, you're identifying, you're actually correct, and you're being really insightful at cutting these people off, and you're doing a lot of damage. Drum roll.
Right.
To the left. and you're giving
Right.
cover for right-wing bigots, and you're on. This is why I've had people say to me. I had somebody from an academic from Princeton say this to me directly in email. You are
Right.
enabling the likes of Chris Rufo.
Right. I actually say
And,
you are. I say you
yes,
are by accentuating the identity politics, by allowing you a free pass. You're actually empowering the right wing, and the only way you can actually tame the right wing is to tame your own house first. That's one argument. There's another argument. I'm never sure how to answer some of these folks, but one of the things I like to say is, look, even if the situation is more severe on the right, that doesn't mean that I shouldn't deal with my own backyard. Like, let's say there's a water main break across town. There might also be a gaping pothole on my street. Now, it doesn't follow that I'm not going to actually fix the gaping pothole on my street. And people say, so you're saying that the gaping pothole is not as serious as the water main break? I said, maybe. But here's the thing. I think you actually don't realize how serious the pothole is. And this is what frustrates me too, is that there's a lot of people who just seem incapable of any abstract thinking. They don't understand how the fundamental operating system has been corrupted. And so they treat wokeism as just sort of, as you said, eccentricity on the left, maybe a crazy academic in the anthropology department going a little too far, but it really doesn't mean anything. And they don't understand to what degree ideas help form policies, the way that ideas define culture. And they don't even see ideas at all. They can be very smart people who do not understand how ideas function in society. They do not see the operating system at all. And so I'm debating somebody who literally cannot actually examine ideological trends because they're sort of so low to the ground.
Brandy, anything to add?
No, I mean, I don't get questioned the same way, I think, or challenged the same way. My experience is slightly different, perhaps for a few different reasons, maybe because I'm a woman, maybe because I'm Black, I don't know. But there are different, and there's a different idea, I think, because I can't be put in a particular ideological box. I'm a social worker. I don't shy away from the fact that I'm liberal and that I've been a lifelong Democrat. I think because of those reasons, that's why I have this stand that I have against ideology that I see as fundamentally illiberal. Absolutely.
All right. I think we can end it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, great. Can you plug your podcast a little bit on here? Because I actually wasn't even aware of it, and I need to be, based on the quality of the conversation I've had with you.
Yeah, we do the Jewish Contrarians podcast. So it's the two of us, and we usually pick a topic. I usually go on an epic rant in the beginning, and then Brandy sets me straight with it. So, the sort of the more grounded of us, my head's in the clouds, her feet are on the ground. I don't know. Maybe. Yeah. I also like to, I'm not sure Brandy loves this language, but I always like to call it like partners in thought crime.
I like it. It sounds like an awesome band. Let's see.
It does, doesn't
it? Right, exactly. So, but yeah, we talk about issues and we try to give it a Jewish angle the best we can. So we'll talk about the big culture war issues, like, the Florida African-American history controversy, but say, okay, someone said this about the Holocaust curriculum. How does that fit into this? And give it a bit of a Jewish angle.
Okay, one final thing then. Is there anything we can do now? Is there anything we can do now to kind of bring this cultural malaise to an end? And we'll finish on that.
Brandy? Want to start, Brandy?
No, go ahead. You start, David.
So I have a few things. One, as I say, we're in the courage business, get more moderates to speak up. But the other one is that I think we have to start to build a sort of a more political movement of the center. People who are, by center, I mean people capable of talking to each other. Right. I think we have to organize ethnic communities into that largely are rational, came to this country largely or to the West because they were seeking better conditions for their families. We've got to get those people to understand what's at stake here and then to organize them accordingly. I think there's tremendous opportunity to do that, but I don't think sometimes working with liberals is like herding cats. Yes. We don't like to work in cooperation with each other because the other guy might be just a little wrong. So because they're just a little wrong, we can't then cooperate with them because we might get implicated in their wrongness. I think we've got to get over that and sort of, I don't want us to politicize ourselves to the degree that we cease to be liberals. Like we should still be independent thinkers, but understand that we've got to start forming sort of political blocks and coalitions so that we can effectively push back against it and push back against the extreme right or even the extreme anti-woke right, which shouldn't represent us.
No, should not. Absolutely. Brandy.
I mean, I think the first step is stop letting other people claim to represent us because they may share a particular, characteristic with us. I think from my experience, that's what's led to a lot of harmful policies. People claiming to speak for the Black community, like there's just one, and there's,
Yes,
go with that, and the like, and have the willingness to actually come out and say what we want, why we want it, and demand better.
Right. Well, as a liberal, no, I'm joking. All right. Well, look, thank you very much. Hopefully we'll do this again at some point on something else. It was really, 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 really great fun. And thank you also by kind of drawing attention to because we're all involved with the Institute for Liberal Values. Thank you for kind of drawing attention and really well articulating what our kind of mission is and how we aim to bring about change by being courageous and also tolerant.
Thank very much. Enjoyed it.
Okay, so we're going to record a bit of an addendum here with Brandy. Hopefully David will drop in. Obviously, because the podcast we recorded last time, it hadn't gone out yet, but we recorded that on October the 5th. And on October the 7th, I think it's really hard to put it into words. Possibly the worst atrocities of the 21st century. Certainly the worst atrocities that have ever been filmed in such a way in the 21st century, if not ever at all. I mean, while we know that things like this happen in parts of the world, what has been completely different about this is that the people who did this, who went around carting off young girls who had visibly been raped because they were bleeding, beheading babies, murdering children, old people, and filming it on GoPros, on cameras, because the organization that did it thought that doing so would make them look good. It was a boast. Now, let's put that into context. The Nazis, as evil and as hideous as they were, and of course, the Nazis, the scale of the murder was much greater. So you could say from a consequentialist point of view that the Nazis were worse. They never boasted about what happened in the concentration camps. They tried to cover it up. They tried to hide it. These people aren't trying to cover anything up. It's not even that they're kind of taking an indifferent thing. We did it and we're not going to cover it up. They're actually boasting about that. And so that alone is, or at least should be, earth-shattering to anyone with half a heart, regardless of whether you're Jewish or not. This is an assault on a liberal democracy against perfectly innocent civilians. So that would be enough. But what's happened since then? Across the world, we've seen professors at universities. Recently, this morning, we saw a professor at university calling for violence or against Jewish people. We've seen professors, in our elite institutions. We're not talking about some fringe lunatic on the far right who has about 3 mates and lives in some shithole in the deep south. We're talking about people at the New York Times. We're talking about people at Harvard. UC Davis celebrating violence against Jewish people in the aftermath of this awful attack. I mean, I feel I knew the problem was bad. And we talked about it last time, but we had quite a playful chat. But I never thought it was on this scale. I feel like I'm in an episode of Sliders, and I've just slipped into some weird dystopian alternate reality. Brandy, any idea what's going on? How do you feel?
I don't think that that I have the words to describe the horror of what happened and the brutality that was inflicted on Israelis by Hamas terrorists on October 7th and since, because there are dozens and dozens of people that were taken into captivity and stolen away into this terrorist enclave. I'm not surprised at the brutality of Hamas. I think that it's a cold, hard reality that terrorists do exactly that, commit acts of terror. What is slightly shocking, not a whole lot, but is the celebration of that brutality here in the United States, and in the streets of London and Paris and Berlin, as we've seen on the news, and what continues, and the fact that it's coming from the halls of academia. But it does, I think it can be said that maybe I shouldn't be shocked, because they've been saying it for years in the ideology, in the pedagogy, and in the rhetoric. The idea that any group that can be labeled as having been oppressed can never do any wrong. And so you see statements coming out like all violence is rooted in oppression, which excuses this type of behavior. And I think the interesting part is that it kind of takes the flip of what the ideology claims, the flip side of what the ideology claims to represent. So you have a group of people who are marching on the front lines of the Me Too movement and hashtagging Believe All Women, who are dismissing the fact or excusing the fact or ignoring the fact that little girls and women have been sexually brutalized. But to them, that's excusable because those victims were Jews or were Israelis. And the victimizers, the rapists, their violence is excused because, they've been oppressed. And so to these horrible people, rape is an act of resistance. It's disgusting.
Yeah, I mean, disgusting is not strong enough, maybe. Repugnant, repulsive. There aren't any words for this. Like, how can you explain that kind of thing away?
Well, see, they don't have to. That's the key point. Once you accept kind of the first bite of this ideology, you're eating the whole bowl of it. And that's the whole point, and that's what makes it so dangerous and so problematic. Once the idea is that this group of people, we will call them the oppressors, they're so dehumanized that the most horrific things can happen to them and be not only excused, but we will celebrate it because they deserved it. And that type of brutality and dehumanization is what led to people being captured and taken as property to be brutalized and enslaved and tortured and raped and mutilated and families torn away in early American history. To see it repeated in the 21st century and seeing it celebrated on college campuses, in the halls of high schools, and in town squares in major cities around the world is there isn't a word for that. That should not be normal. And the people that are doing the celebrating should not be lifted up, and that can't be normalized.
Obviously not, but it's not obvious, is it? I mean, it's obvious to me. One would hope that it's obvious to the people who are listening to this. I mean, if you're a liberal, by the way, now, you can, if you like, criticize Israel, Netanyahu as much as you like. In Israel, by the way, you can do that. You can get on a plane, you can go to Israel, and you can say whatever you like about the state of Israel, and you would still be protected by the IDF and the military of Israel. The same is not true elsewhere in the Middle East. But even if we look at this from like a an oppressed point of view, that even doesn't make sense either, right? Because historically speaking, the Jews have been one of the most, if not the most, oppressed group of people in human history, and remain so. I mean, if you look at the evidence of anti-Semitism in the United States, for example, which even before this incident we knew was on the rise, now it's, I mean, you even if you're completely illiterate when it comes to statistics, I mean, now that's completely undeniable. Jewish people have been. Why does the state of Israel exist? Right? The state of Israel exists not because a group of Jewish people got together and thought, oh, it would be nice if we had our own state. It was because there were pogroms against the Jews. It was because the Jews were an oppressed people and they needed to band together in order to preserve themselves, as was made clear, as everyone knows. I mean, we know what happened in World War II. I mean, it's still within living memory for some people. But there is this staggering historical illiteracy, philosophical illiteracy, incoherence even in their own ideology, which I despise for all the same reasons that you do and you articulated. What is I mean, can you contextualize the intellectual failure here?
So I mean, I think that being blind to history can lead to some of it, but also there's just the plain fact that people that are highly educated can also hold bigoted points of view. And we know that, right? Like some of the most highly educated people, and I'll stick to the country in which I reside, in the United States, have been the ones that have drafted the most horrendous, racist, bigoted laws and policies. And we know that already. And I don't think that part is any different. The bigotry isn't any different. The anti-Semitism isn't. I'm not surprised that university professors are anti-Semitic. What concerns me is that they're comfortable not just holding on to anti-Semitic and even vocalizing anti-Semitic ideology. It's that they're using that to support brutality. And to be able to have an argument on what number of infants were beheaded versus just shot or burned alive, and that's the hill that they're willing to die on, because they're accepting the lie that has allowed them to feel comfortable taking that position. And the lies reside in the ideas of, Jews can't have been oppressed because right now, real or perceived, they're successful. And anybody who's achieved any level of success doesn't belong in the oppressed box anymore. They doesn't to the oppressor box.
But doesn't this whole thing just belie, like, it just exposes the outright nonsense? Okay, so one of the kind of things that I've come across, when even among kind of people who are against critical social justice, is they'd say something like, "Oh well, isn't it a bit funny that there are so many Jewish people in positions of power?" And because that's the kind of subtle anti-Semitic kind of hint. Okay, if that anti-Semitic conspiracy theory was true, if the Jews were in control of the media and secretly puppeting everything behind the scenes, this reaction that we are seeing in the West, again, in the elite institutions, which are supposedly the ones that are controlled by the Jews, the likes of the New York Times, Harvard, the Ivy League university, there would be clear and unequivocal support for Israel and the Jewish communities all around the world. That is not happening. Clearly shows that this anti-Semitic conspiracy. I mean, nobody with half a brain. Well, I have to keep correcting myself, right? I'm just saying nobody with half a brain cell believed that, but evidently they did. Evidently they do. I just don't see how the veil is not dropping from people's eyes here. But it is shocking.
I wouldn't expect, because part of the kind of crux of anti-Semitism is the circular thinking, right? It has that, where, because it's rooted in a conspiracy, and conspiracy theories tend to do that. So there isn't really a rationalizing any type of conspiracy theory, which anti-Semitism is probably one of the worst and biggest, or at least it relies on anti-Semitic tropes and stereotyping. And I don't think there's a way to rationalize out of that. I think what we're seeing right now in the halls of schools and in certain, media is an attempt by people who hold these anti-Semitic beliefs to rationalize their way out of it, and it's not working. They're trying. I hear it. Well, we have to excuse Hamas, a known terror organization, for the murder of babies and for the kidnapping of the elderly and the slaughter of innocents in their bedrooms because they were oppressed. So that means they can do anything. And that's what we're dealing with. There's no rationality to that type of thinking.
I mean, so I've been having fights with people. The most, as one is inclined to do somewhat, you may have noticed, I tend to come out swinging. The most sophisticated form of the argument that I've come across is, of course, like the acts of Hamas are brutal, but we have to understand the context of what's happened. Sure. What is the context of what's happened? Again, Israel is held to this impossible standard, as you kind of alluded to just before we started recording. Israel has made mistakes. There isn't a liberal democracy in the world that hasn't done some bad things in the course of its existence, and Israel is a liberal democracy, right? But the standard of Israel compared to the totalitarian dictatorships and failed states, the likes of Syria, of Lebanon, of even of Jordan, even Egypt. Egypt's one of the better states in the region. It just doesn't compare. In terms of any measure you care to take, whether that be tolerance to ethnic minorities. I think about 20% of the population of Israel is Arab, right? And they have two political parties. Tolerance towards homosexuals. I don't know, but I'm sure if you wanted to go to a gay nightclub in Tel Aviv, you wouldn't have a problem finding one. Prosperity, economic
Women's
development,
right,
women's
the right
right.
for girls to go to school. Yeah.
I mean, we could just go on. So does Israel make mistakes? Well, yeah, sure. Should that be in the context? Okay. But let's look at the context then. Let's look at the rest of and look, Israel hasn't occupied Gaza since 2005. Israel has been quite up for a two-state solution. And it seems to have been the Palestinian people. And unfortunately, you can make this distinction between, you can and you should make this distinction between Hamas and the Palestinian people, because of course I'm sure there are quite a lot of Palestinians who despise Hamas. But there was a poll recently that said that 72% of them support them in this kind of jihad against Israel. So there's lots of Palestinians who aren't exactly the most wonderful people in the world. And by the way, part of the reason why they're not the most wonderful people in the world, and part of the reason why they believe these awful things, is because they genuinely are oppressed. But not by Israel.
So a few months back, Gazans were protesting in the street against Hamas. And there was a bit of chatter in the West that this was because those Gazans wanted liberalism, small L liberalism, more rights, more freedom, etc. Because obviously a terrorist organization like Hamas isn't allowing its citizens those things. They're throwing gay people off the roofs of buildings and jailing any political opponents and forcing women to abide by a certain level of Sharia law. Those Gazans were protesting for the most part wasn't for the move towards more freedoms and small L liberalism. It was for basics like, more access to food and electricity that worked, and water and plumbing. We've heard a lot about water over these past 12 days because Hamas has broken down any piping that's been funded by the EU and the UN to make rockets to kill Israeli civilians. And so I think that there's a wider conversation to be had, not tonight, at a much later time, about civilization and ideology and culture and what that means and what part that plays in what we just saw. Because I will argue until proven wrong or presented with different information that this was Hamas didn't kill those people and rape those girls and women and little kids and cut off the fingers and pull out the eyes of children for a Palestinian state or for anything about occupation. This was a lynching. There isn't any context that makes this pogrom, these lynchings, acceptable. Period.
Completely agree. And by the way, you're complaining about Israel, not you obviously, but people are complaining about Israel shutting off the water supply, and fine. You could argue whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. You could argue on the one hand it's part of a siege, you want to get people out of buildings, or you could say, well, no, it's going to cause suffering. Fine, have that debate. But when you said that Hamas was digging up EU pipes and making them into rockets, by the way, Hamas boasted about that. They released propaganda videos showing them doing exactly that, literally digging up pipes and turning them into rockets. This isn't Israeli propaganda. None of this is Israeli propaganda. All of this is Hamas themselves boasting about what they do. There is no need for Israel to say anything on the matter because Hamas are saying it themselves. They're proud of this. We've got people on I can't remember his name, Ali, one of the senior Hamas leaders who lives in Qatar, I think. And he was on the Arabic version of Russia Today. And he was saying quite clearly, again, boasting. He was saying, look, essentially the highest honor for any Palestinian person is to be martyred. And that's great. So for him, the cold rationalization of some of these people is that if children, soldiers, women, whatever, die on their side in the cause of warfare, then that's the best possible thing that could happen to them because they're fast-tracked up to heaven. And it's hard for us in the liberal West to get our head around that logic, not because it's incoherent. It's perfectly coherent. If you believe that, then that would follow. But because it's just so alien to us. But what we have to realize,
but it shouldn't be.
No, it
right?
shouldn't be.
It actually shouldn't be. We in the United States, when you think about the before the Civil War and the Confederacy, and then what followed as far as lynchings, what was normalized and accepted, and how did it become that way? And what does that say about the society and culture that was normalized and acceptable? To sell human beings, to brutalize and whip human beings, to tear babies from their mother's arms, to sell them as property. So there have been instances in our own history where brutality was normalized. That doesn't make it right, and it doesn't make it okay. And it doesn't mean that when we see it across an ocean or in another continent or another region of the world, that we should be celebrating it, especially as liberals.
Right. It's just absolutely astonishing. I don't know what world I live in anymore. I mean, I knew there were people who were anti-Semitic, but I mean, here's the thing, right? Like one of my favorite things, like I used to, I'm a bit of a skeptic, and I have this kind of like interest in things and debunking claims. Like for example, the rocket. Hamas. Hamas puts out this thing saying, okay, a strike has just hit a Gazan hospital and killed 1 million people or whatever they said. I think it was 5,500 or something ridiculous. Yeah. And immediately, like, the appropriate response to that would be, maybe they have, maybe they haven't. I mean, Israel might accidentally hit a hospital. It might be that the hospital is full of terrorists. You don't know. But whatever, take this with a pinch of salt, right? Take this claim with a pinch of salt. Keep an open mind. Do some reading and find out what's actually happened. Reserve judgment until you've got a clear idea and you can be confident about what the facts are. But that's not what we saw. We saw politicians. We saw the New York Times. We saw all kinds of people coming out and condemning the IAF or the IDF for this rocket attack, even though, like, if you spent 5 minutes just to think about it, not even, you should have gone, But people, here's the thing. People are wary about believing what Israel says, and maybe you should be, fine. Question everything and all of that, no problem with that. But if you're wary and you question what Israel does as a liberal democracy that has a democratically elected government, why wouldn't you question Hamas? That so many, apparently intelligent people were just ready to believe whatever Hamas said. A terrorist organization, well, not just a terrorist organization, by the way, the worst terrorist organization. Even ISIS didn't behead babies.
But people have been believing Hamas, because any Palestinian health ministry number that comes out of Gaza is a Hamas number of casualties. And so this latest war now, any number that comes out of there is coming from Hamas.
Of course.
Like it has in years past. So the idea that our journalists and our media and then our Congress people take that and run with it goes to show that of course they will. Because in order to justify their support and celebration of terrorist brutality, they have to be able to point the finger at Israel and at Jews and say, see, you're bad too. You deserve everything that came at you. And we see sitting congresswomen, Rashida Tlaib, who I don't know if she took her tweet down. It's on X, whatever it's called now. I don't know if she has taken it down yet. It's that after all of that false news story came out blaming Israel, we saw what happened around the world, where this again, and this is another example of how anti-Zionism and anti-Israel sentiment is anti-Semitism. We saw synagogues firebombed. We saw Jewish students cornered and surrounded in faculty buildings. We've seen people get death threats and be beaten and be stabbed after a lie comes out. And we have people sitting in the United States Congress right now that are fomenting that violence against Jews around the world and not being held accountable. So, I mean, while this is what happened and is still happening is horrific and horrible, I will say that the amount of people who don't really have such a connection to Israel or to Jewish communities who've actually come out and been so supportive and just absolutely shocked at what they're seeing and how they're seeing, okay, this is what, the Jewish community members have been saying around the world about anti-Semitism, gives me hope, because that has been incredible. The amount of people that are calling out the leaders in Congress and the bad journalism and media for their mistakes is, there are a lot of people that are doing that. I'm appreciative of it.
And it's worth also pointing out, because I mean, this is another kind of fight that I've got into, right? It's really worth pointing out that doing this is valuable, right? Pointing out the misinformation, pointing out the lies, trying to get people to pause to think about things. It's important to do that, because these lies are spreading and they are having a real impact. I mean, I think it was yesterday, as you pointed out, a synagogue in Berlin was firebombed. Immediately after the events, the immediate aftermath of the Hamas attack, children in Jewish schools in London were told that they couldn't go to school. The schools were closed down because of just mobs of idiots, were threatening to attack them. So it is important. So if you are one of those people and you're maybe coming up against journalists like I'm coming up against, who are saying, oh, you're just a keyboard warrior, it's meaningless to do this, and when other people are bleeding in Israel, I said, no, it fucking isn't, and you know that because you're trying to fight the other end of the propaganda war, right? It is really important to push back against this stuff. And look, I mean, just I remember as a kid and about when I say a kid, about 22, 23 years old, like going through the internet, I used to love conspiracy theories, right? Just delight in reading about conspiracy theories. Like one of my favorite ones was that World War II never really happened, and it was all like smoke and mirrors and stuff. But that used to be a source of entertainment for me, right? That was the world we lived in. One of my other favorite ones was the Nazis were never defeated. They retreated to the other side of the moon, and they've been secretly building a Nazi. Did you ever hear that one? It was actually, oh, it was brilliant. There was a movie made out of it, and people actually believed it, that Hitler was being kept alive by alien technology, and then there would be Nazi saucers, flying saucers that would come back and attack the world. Yeah, that was one. This was entertainment for me, right? And one of the entertaining conspiracy theories, although it was a real harmful and dangerous one, but I just looked at it and I was like, how did anybody believe that? How wild is this? And it was entertaining that people used to believe this crap, even though people suffered, was the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, right? You just look at that and like, wow, how do you believe something as crazy as that? But is there much difference, both in terms of bizarre absurdity, what should be laughably bizarre absurdity, between the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and this notion that Israel is involved in a genocide against the Palestinians, or even ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians? Is there any difference in terms of the bizarre, and again, ought to be laughable absurdity between the two, and the dangerousness? And yet I see academics on my Instagram and Facebook just putting this stuff up there. And the reason they're putting this stuff up there is they think it makes them look smart. They think that they're going to get, if they didn't, they wouldn't be saying it. If they thought, if I write this, I'm going to look like a complete fucking idiot, they wouldn't be putting it out there. But they are.
Right. I mean, there isn't any real negative consequence to bad scholarship. And so words get thrown out, and it becomes kind of this PR social media war. So the word ethnic cleansing, settler colonialism, genocide, apartheid, they don't mean anything anymore because they're just thrown out in this kind of word soup, to be able to describe how horrible Israel is. And so that's why whatever happens to Israelis, they deserve it. It's horrendous, but it is the same kind of demonization that we see in the lead up to actual genocides. I mean, this is what's happened if we look at the history of genocides in places from Rwanda to Yugoslavia to the Holocaust. There was this rhetoric of dehumanization, and it came from, at least in the case of the Holocaust, it didn't start in the backwoods country with what people would assume is a redneck. It started in the universities from the academics.
The likes of Heidegger and people like that who were kind of, I mean, absolutely. This is absolutely chilling. I have long been against critical social justice. I have long known that there is a dangerous anti-Semitic streak that runs through that ideology. But even I didn't think it was this bad. And I'm terrified now. Because, and not just for Jewish people either. Not just for Jewish people, right? Because Israel is a shield for the West. Every Jew-hating, murderous ideologue in that country who is fomenting violence and terrorism against Jews and Israel, where do you think they're going to go next? Presuming, let's say Israel, and let's say you get what you want, right? Let's say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free of all Jews and you've got your own nation state, right? What do you think will be next? Who do you think they're going to turn on next? Now, if you know the last 25 years of history or so, you'd know, right?
Yeah, and I mean, we've seen already this question's been posed to these states that have ethnically cleansed their Jewish populations. So horrible story of a mob in Tunisia burning down and ransacking the remains of a synagogue there. Well, the synagogue was empty because Tunisia has no Jews left in it. They had to leave and flee and were kicked out, or if they weren't murdered. You look at countries in the region; they have no Jews left there. So we know what from the river to the sea means because it's happened in living memory.
And we're next, by the way. Non-Jews are next, right? The ideology will go after us. These people are quite clear. You know, Hamas make it quite clear that they don't just want to liberate Palestine. You know, liberate in they want to exterminate the Jews wherever they are. And people who hold to this kind of extreme Sunni Wahhabi Salafist kind of warped ideology, that they literally see world conquest. If they achieve, and they won't, because the Israeli military is, thank God, is very, very capable. But if they were to achieve their goals, the West would be next, right? We know that this,
they've
done it,
right. This is the leaders of Hamas who celebrated this brutality called on Islamists around the world to do the same thing wherever they live. And so we know what they want to do and what they're going to try to do, which is the same thing any supremacist group does. They try to conquer. And Hamas is, yes, they're a terrorist organization that relies on a certain form of supremacist ideology. That's what they do. They conquer. It's submit or we will kill you, or maybe we'll just kill you. But that's supremacist ideology, and we've seen it with people in supremacist organizations in times past.
And here we are at this really bizarre stage of history that the people who claim to be the champions of the downtrodden, the anti-racists, you know, who boast about this, are excusing the most appalling act of ethnically stroke religiously motivated racism in the 21st century. It's just and again, we keep going back to this point, and in some of the elite institutions, where do we go from here?
I think acknowledging that they're not so elite, are they? They're not. It's not so great to be associated with an institution that excuses rape or paints rape as resistance, is it?
No.
We go to not celebrating those places because they're nothing to be celebrated for. The names of these institutions hold no weight anymore because they have no morality.
All right, let's end it on that. Thank you very much. I hope you are as well as can be expected in my opinion, in the darkest days of the 21st century. I hope that this conflict is brought to a speedy end. But actually, and before we end, I think there's one thing I kind of have to add, because this is also important. There takes time in growing up as an intellectual where you have to realize that while war is awful and inevitably wreaks havoc, no matter how good your intentions are, how many precautions you take not to harm innocent civilians, the innocent civilians, you know, including children, women, are going to die. And that is absolutely horrific. But sometimes, nevertheless, when a great evil shows its face like this and acts in a way that it has, and this was true with the Nazis in World War II, you have to commit to fighting that, knowing that there will be awful consequences, because the consequences of not fighting it are even worse. If the West and Israel lets Hamas off the hook and goes into a ceasefire, which is what Hamas want right now, will that save lives? Yeah, in the short term. But in the long term, the misery will be much, much, much worse, because Hamas is the tip of the iceberg, right? In terms of other terrorist organizations and countries that are surrounding Israel. I mean, we have now in the north of Israel and on the southern border, Hezbollah, which are a Shiite military faction that are far more capable, with far more resources and far better weapons than Hamas. And at the moment, the IDF is fully mobilized, so the northern border looks pretty strong. And so, maybe Hezbollah might not attack. They might attack. But the point is that if we don't do something about this right now, the consequences down the line will be much, 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 much worse. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes, I think that it comes down to, there's a point where there's a right and a wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's pretty clear that the side of terrorists and people who are okay killing infants and the elderly are on the side of wrong. And I would hope that those of us who have the privilege to live in free societies would be able to make the choice to side with what's right.
Yeah, and just remember that those kids that were killed or carted off, they could be your kids. And these people, regardless of whether you're a Jew or not, these people would have no reservations doing it to you. The only thing that stops them is because they haven't reached a critical mass yet within our societies. But they're threatening to. That's why that they can go around, and we should have seen this coming, right? A few years ago, we saw in London groups of thugs in cars parading around, kill the Jews and rape their daughters. They should have been dealt with then. We should have known that the writing was on the wall then, when they could do that unmolested in London. Now we're seeing much, 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 much worse. If you believe in liberalism and liberal values at all, then you need to push back. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank